And our Geek Out today is on Veeam and NetApp integration. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. If you have any questions during the webinar, please put them into the chat and we'll try and get to them live. Anything that's not answered live, we'll send you an email, so we'll be in touch. I really like posing hard questions to our guests here on Geek Out, so please ask all the questions that you have, and we will be, as always, giving out prizes for the best questions at the end of the session. Okay, so I'm joined here today by two very smart guys, Nelson Simo of Veeam, Christopher Jones of NetApp. These guys know Veeam and NetApp integration inside out, so I'm actually really excited to have them here and picking their brains. Nelson, could you introduce yourself, just a little bit about you, what you do at Veeam, how long you've been there, and how to get a hold of you?
Yeah, absolutely, Phoebe. So my name's Nelson Simo. I'm a senior systems engineer at Veeam Software, and I've been with Veeam for just over 7 years now. So certainly seen the company grow to where we are today. I'm aligned to two enterprise account managers and focus primarily on the New South Wales territory. Best way to contact me is either by phone or email, and I'm sharing my email address at the very end of the presentation.
Awesome. And Chris?
Yeah, so I've been with NetApp for 2 years now. Prior to this, I was a customer of Veeam, and Nelson was actually the SE on my account. I'm a professional services consultant, so I'm mostly out in the field designing and deploying solutions for our customers. If anyone wants to contact me, yeah, my email will be at the end of this slide. It's just chris.jones@netapp.com. Or you can find me on LinkedIn, just search for Chris Jones NetApp, and I'll come up.
Awesome. So I've got a question just before we dive into things. Nelson, what do you find? I mean, this is the second time this week actually that we've had a partner of NetApp in the room with us for Geek Out, and I'm really excited about it. How do you find working with NetApp? What's it like, you know, working with Chris as a customer and now as a partner?
Yeah, look, it's always been a very positive relationship. Like Chris said, you know, I worked with him when he was in customer land, and I think the passion and the integration between Veeam and NetApp has always been very positive. You know, what I take away from the integration is that it's the tightest and best integration that we've got. And I think the relationship with with both of us is growing stronger every day. And I guess that's also kudos to our alliance manager, Aggie Grom, who focuses on building that relationship, not just only in the ANZ region, but across the whole of APAC. So yeah, it's always been very positive from my perspective.
Yep, and Chris, I mean, you were at Insight a couple of weeks ago. Met a couple of the guys from there as well. How do you find the relationship between NetApp and Veeam?
Yeah, I find the relationship great. I mean, previously when I was a customer, I used the storage integration with Veeam with another storage vendor, and I always wished I had the integration that I have with NetApp. So the integration we get with Veeam is just amazing. So, and the guys at Veeam are always open. They're happy to help. They keep us updated. They're great guys to work with.
Awesome, cool. So I'm going to hand over to Nelson so we can get straight into it. And yeah, we'll dive into the demo.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Phoebe. So obviously what I'll do is I'll start off with a very brief agenda, everyone, and we're going to try to keep it as free-flowing as possible. So Chris obviously knows Veeam very well and NetApp even better. So I do have a couple of slides just to really, I guess, build the foundation, but rest assured I'm going to spend the majority of the time in our demo lab environment, which I'm sure all of you are pretty eager to see. So agenda is really going to comprise on what the big picture is in terms of the integration between Veeam and NetApp, and then go through some of those highlights. What are the integration points? Go through the current support, best practices, any limitations, and then dive straight into the demonstration. And as Phoebe mentioned, if you've got any questions, please keep them coming. We'll certainly answer them at the very end, live on the webinar. So, I mean, in terms of the big picture that I mentioned, when I speak to customers and get an understanding of what they're trying to achieve, a lot of customers and even partners may already be using NetApp today and using SnapMirror, using SnapVault, And, adding Veeam to that picture is really trying to simplify your day-to-day management, trying to give you a single point of orchestration. So being able to drive that from one place, being able to set up your backup policies, but also leverage, built-in SnapMirror, SnapVault, and I'm sure, Chris, when you were at your previous job, you did exactly this, where you're able to do that in one place once your relationships are set up, and it just makes the management of the whole environment a lot easier.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so everyone on NetApp customers are already familiar with SnapMirror, SnapVault, our snapshots, our flex clones, and how easy they are to use and how efficient they are. And with Veeam's integration with this is we can leverage those capabilities to get all the functionality of Veeam, so the quick restores, the application level restores, all from our snapshots, which are lightning fast, efficient, and proven in the field.
Yeah. And obviously with all of that sort of brings us to the highlights and I guess the integration point. So, the most common integration points that we've got is the fact that we actually integrate with data on tap. So being able to back up from a data on tap snapshot, whether it's in production, whether it is a SnapMirror snapshot, whether it's a SnapVault snapshot, being able to minimize the impact on the VMware infrastructure is really key here, especially when you're trying to back up, potentially during the day where there's a lot more going on your VMware data store. So, not really just being able to back up once a day, but potentially backing up a lot more frequently, which could be, every hour or even every 15 minutes if you've got those specific RPOs. So having that integration is key here. Performance is something that we've always seen and heard from our customers and partners, and the reason we do get, the performance that we do is because we still very tightly integrate with VMware. So for anyone who's ever used it, and you'll see in a few moments in the demo, we still do take a VMware snapshot, and the reason we do is because we still want to leverage technologies like change block tracking. We've got our own application consistency, which happens during that time. And because we're integrating with change block tracking, we can do backups very fast, and that's where you get the performance. When it comes to SLAs and RTPOs, Veeam has always been very focused on speed of recovery. So a lot of the tools that we have, and you're going to see that with either doing it from a NetApp Snap and the different types of recovery options, or doing it from a Veeam backup, is that all of those options are very fast, they're very easy to use, and they can also be very granular, especially when you're talking about applications. And then the last point there is that Veeam today can be used for much more than just actually recovering VMs and items that you need. We can start to leverage it for doing things like troubleshooting in a sandbox environment, using it for recoverability verification, and that's certainly something that I'll show you in the demo environment, how that works a little bit more in depth. So in terms of the current support, we do support both 7 mode and obviously clustered mode, so CDOT. In the current version of Veeam, we've got support from ONTAP 8.1 right up to 9.4. Obviously with as soon as 9.5 is released, Veeam will surely be supporting it in its next update, which is almost pretty much in line with when NetApp will be releasing their one. So in terms of protocols that are supported, we support the usual, so iSCSI, Fiber, NFS, Fiber Channel Ethernet. And in terms of best practices, and Chris might be able to add a bit more here, but one thing that I've noticed when I've set up these environments, and customers have as well, is it's always helpful to choose the volumes that you're wanting to back up with Veeam. And obviously in your environment you might have multiple arrays, multiple controllers. You may not want to be using Veeam to back up everything. And if you're only trying to back up specific volumes, to choose those volumes when you add Veeam to the console, which I'll show you later on, just to speed that process up. But Chris, I guess, is there any other best practices that you can add to that?
No, the thing to understand is with, so in ONTAP we have the I groups for access to iSCSI and FC LUNs, and we have export policies for our NFS volumes, is that Veeam for iSCSI and NFS will manage those for you. So it will automatically create an iGroup, add its initiators for its proxies that it needs to be able to access those LUNs for restores. It'll add itself to your NFS export policies, so it can mount and recover your VMs and back them up. For Fibre Channel, you still will need to zone it in to your Fabric as normal, but the rest of it's taken care for you.
And all of these are documented in Veeam and NetApp documentation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And at the very end, when we get to the links that we've got to share, there is a Veeam and NetApp configuration guide, which basically takes you through that from end to end. So for anyone who's never done it before, which could be a lot of you, you'll certainly have that documented. In terms of the storage devices supported, they will cover all the ones that are expected. So your NetApp FAS, AFF, FlexArray, ONTAP Edge, Select Cloud, and all the FAS OEM.
Can I jump in there and just ask as well? So with Select, and well, obviously Select is a virtual appliance running out on maybe at an edge site with Cloud, which is running inside one of the hyperscalers, AWS or Azure. How would Veeam just work with those just the same way that it does with an on-premise array?
ONTAP Select, yes, works exactly the same, just integrated as any other array. The Cloud VSA, and correct me if I'm wrong, Nelson, is essentially a virtual appliance in the cloud which you can replicate from your on-prem backups to the cloud for storage.
Yeah, spot on. Yeah, absolutely. That's it. So it's no different.
Yeah. So you get to maintain the same management platform, same processes
across the board,
from your data to your backup to your data management. Yeah, awesome.
Exactly. And the last point that I wanted to mention on this slide as well is obviously what's coming up in our update 4. So we are going to be, apart from the supported devices, is being able to also integrate with NetApp HCI and SolidFire. So look out for more on that when update 4 gets closer to release in early Jan.
Yeah.
So in terms of, I guess, going a little bit deeper, I mentioned that one of the highlights and integration points for Veeam and NetApp is being able to back up from a storage snapshot. And what I really wanted to highlight here was that we can do that from either a primary location or a primary array, but also a secondary array. And where we see this come into play is that a lot of the times you may not want to be doing backups from a primary array for a lot of reasons. You may have multiple arrays and you're already leveraging SnapMirror and SnapVault, and it may be preferred to actually be doing backups from a second data center, which would be those SnapMirror snapshots. So once I get into the demo lab, I'll show you, what this looks like in terms of configuration. But it simply means that Veeam will take a backup from a SnapMirror, for example, rather than doing it from a snapshot that's happening on the production array. That being said, you can certainly keep multiple copies of backups, and we certainly always recommend to have at least 3 copies of your data in 2 different locations, and preferably one off-site. And what you'll see here is that the E-Series will certainly make a very good, Veeam repository as your first place to go to, usually for short to mid-term. And then if you're looking at off-site in that to, potentially storage grid for long-term, that is something that we've got coming very soon, and I'll mention more on the next slide.
Yeah, I think the key thing I like here is in steps 1 and 2 on that slide. So Veeam is orchestrating the primary ONTAP snapshot, updating your SnapMirror. It can control your retention at both sides. Is that Veeam doesn't actually have to move a single block of data. Is that ONTAP's doing it all, which we're already familiar with and is already efficient and on our WAN and on our storage utilization. But we can still leverage all of Veeam to recover individual files, folders, application items, entire VMs in seconds from either one of those locations or from the one console. And Veeam hasn't actually had to move any data.
Yeah.
ONTAP's doing it for it.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, and that's something that I'll highlight in the demo is that, you'll get a lot of different restore points that you can now leverage. And where we see customers using Veeam and NetApp today is that they're able to take, those hourly snapshots during the day where they're basically minimizing the most amount of impact on their production storage and VMware environments. And like Chris said, you're still able to drill into a snap and pull out a whole VM or pull out files and application items, but then have that data basically backed up onto an E-Series or push it to storage grid for your long-term retention, where you can still pull that data back and bring it back into production. So the flexibility is really there. So in terms of what's coming, And I mentioned a little bit about storage grid. So Veeam, in its current release, is up to 9.5, version 9.5, update 3A. Update 4 is bringing some, new features into Veeam, which we've all been waiting for. And one of those is really for Veeam to be able to back up to storage grid. So we're calling this capacity tier. And the way this is going to work, without sort of going into the fine details of it, is that Veeam is still going to need to back up to an E-series repository first. So you're going to land your backups for short to mid-term, and you're then going to configure an archive policy that says, I want to archive anything older than 30 days, for example, and those backups will automatically then be sent to storage grid. So the integration with storage grid and S3 is coming as part of update 4. And it'll be configured through what we call the Veeam scale-out backup repository. So you're still going to have your short to mid-term repository, but then your long-term is going to be pushed up into storage grid, for example.
How granular would those kind of long-term backups be? Is it on a volume basis, a file basis, or?
Yeah. So it's really going to come down to the backup policy that you've created. So the backup policy will typically be the VMs that you're protecting. So the idea is that we'll create a backup chain that's either got one VM or multiple VMs in it. The more VMs, the better, because you'll get Veeam's compression and dedupe. And then what you're basically setting up into storage grid is those Veeam backup files in block format, right? So they're stored in S3 as they normally do. And what Veeam is keeping on premise is what they're calling a dehydrated shell. So we're only sending the data up there that needs to be sent, and that means that when you need to restore something, we're only bringing down the blocks that need to be brought down to restore a specific VM from that backup chain or a specific file. So you're being very effective in the data that you're actually bringing back. Yeah, but you can create those backup policies.
So I think if anyone's ever seen a Veeam backup repository, and you see there's a whole bunch of VBK files, which are the Veeam full backups and the incrementals, is that what you'll see in that, you browse that folder and you still see all those files, they're all there, but the blocks are basically hidden off into S3, they're tiered off. So it's a lot like how our fabric pool works in ONTAP, where the data still appears to be local, but the blocks are all shifted off. And another key thing is that for this, we do actually recommend that customers upgrade storage grid to the current release, which I think is 11.1.1.1, because there are improvements in that was made specifically to support Veeam's functionality.
Yeah, so definitely in terms of that integration, right, we work with them to make sure that there's the best kind of functionality in both our object storage and on the
this functionality has been thoroughly tested with our storage grid.
Yeah, and so that storage grid, just because I know you're also a bit of a storage grid user, so that storage grid being the NetApp object storage platform could be used for something more than just Veeam, right?
Yeah. So Veeam essentially will write to a bucket inside a tenant of storage grid, but that storage grid can be hosting workloads for numerous thousands, many other workloads.
Such as Fabric Pool. So if anybody has questions about storage grid, we'll cover that on Geek Out. This is about Veeam, but yeah, definitely throw those into the chat and we'll get back to you.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Yeah, no, good. All good comments. And the last slide that I've got, I promise, before we get into the lab, is really just to highlight something that I'm going to show more about in the demo, is our on-demand sandbox. And for those that aren't aware of it, Veeam can create what we call a data lab or a virtual lab, and all that really is a ring-fenced environment where we're able to turn on virtual machines. It can be from an ONTAP snapshot, it can be from a Veeam backup file, and allows us to do a whole bunch of things in terms of giving you a troubleshooting environment, complete on-demand sandbox, or being able to actually test the recoverability of VMs. So I'll move on and I'll focus a little bit more in the lab in terms of how this gets set up for those that have never seen it. If anyone's got any questions as we go through that, please certainly ask them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to my RDP session here, and hopefully that will come up pretty soon for you guys. Now, for anyone who's never seen the Veeam console before, yes, it is green. It's got lots of green in it. This is pretty much it here. So what I'll do first off is really just show you, for someone who's never set up Veeam and NetApp before, just to give you an idea of how easy it is to set up. And you'll notice that we've got a storage infrastructure tab here where you're able to go through and add your NetApp storage, which we've already done. And once you've added that in, you'll obviously be asked for your management IP, which I can also show you how that works. So if I get edit storage, you're really just putting in the basic information that's required. So management server IP, your credentials, and then of course what the access options are going to be. So is it over fiber? Is it over iSCSI, NFS? And this is where you configure what the protocol is that you're using. I mentioned one of the best practices was to choose the volumes, and this is where you would go through and select the specific volumes if you're not using Veeam to back up from everything. But once you've done that, you'll notice that you can see everything on the left side of the window here, where I can see my different NetApp clusters, I can see my controllers, and if I open up one particular controller, I'll then be able to drill in and actually see the volumes that I've got on there with all the snapshots that either have already been created. So if Veeam, for example, was introduced into an environment where NetApp was already taking snapshots and snap mirrors and snap vaults, we're still able to see those snapshots. And that's something that, that adds a lot of benefit, because you're able to go into a particular snapshot and now see the virtual machines that are actually on that snapshot. So I can pick a particular virtual machine, I can choose Veeam's recovery options, and from a snapshot, I've got 3 recovery options that cover either doing an instant VM, which is where we can then leverage FlexClone to very quickly be able to restore a virtual machine. And apart from that, you may be trying to do a more granular recovery, which could be a specific file across the 15 different file systems that we support, or it might be more specific to an application that you've got. So in the case of AD, you might be trying to restore a user account, or even just an attribute from a user account, or even a group policy attribute. So one of the great use cases of the AD recovery is being able to compare the way a group policy is today in production compared to the way it was backed up last night or from a previous snapshot. So it actually allows you to see what's been changed, which is very handy. So yeah, they're the 3 different recovery options. Chris, I'm not sure if you've got any more to add there.
I think to note there is that, so you can see that the snapshot that Nelson selected is actually one of the hourly ONTAP scheduled snapshots. So that one's being created by ONTAP. And you'll see that the state of the VMs is crash consistent. And that's just because there was no integration into the actual VM by Veeam. But if we go to a snapshot that was created by Veeam with application awareness turned on in the backup job, the state's now application consistent. So that means Veeam has actually injected into VSS and taken a snapshot of the guest operating system and the applications that Veeam support, so they are in a consistent state at the time.
So this would also mean that if, for example, I think you mentioned if it was pointed at an environment that hadn't yet had Veeam configured for it, but we had been taking NetApp snapshots,
100%.
we can still start to leverage those snapshots that we'd taken previously, and now it's all part of the same management.
Yeah, exactly, and you still perform the same restore option, so you can still instantly recover via a FlexClone, that VM direct back to the VMware environment. You can still grab those individual files out of them, even though Veeam didn't create the snapshot.
Yeah,
that's pretty powerful.
Pretty powerful, yeah.
And absolutely, and that's all good points, because that really ties back into the single point of orchestration that we started with, where, like you said, Phoebe and Chris, we're able to bring Veeam into an environment and already start to get value from snapshots that you've already got and start to recover from it. Now, obviously, that's pretty much it in terms of the setting up. Once you've added, you've made the connections into NetApp, you'll then be able to go through and actually start to create some of the jobs for protecting VMs running on the NetApp arrays. Now I've got 3 jobs that have been created here, and I thought I'd go through the different use cases of how Veeam can start to take backups. And the very first one is, your most common one, is backing up from a NetApp snapshot, right? And this is really the big integration point where you're relying a lot less on the hypervisor snapshots, which we know are probably not as efficient running during the day when there's a lot more going on the VMware data stores. And being able to offload that to the storage processor is really key here. So looking at this particular job, and actually before I go into it, one thing I wanted to highlight is this particular job will show you when the storage snapshots have been created, but more importantly, when each virtual machine is backed up, it is still creating that VMware snapshot And during that time, it's basically doing the two things I mentioned earlier on, where it's collecting information about the change blocks, it's doing our application awareness. But you'll notice very shortly after that, which is less than 20 seconds, we're removing that VMware snapshot from the environment. So we're no longer running that virtual machine from a snapshot. It's able to leverage data on tap to now take a snapshot of the volume, and that's really key. That's where we're offloading a lot of the work to the NetApp, which is really designed to do that very efficiently. And the bottom line is that when it deletes a storage snapshot, you'll notice that it's instant, and that's why it's got minimal impact on the production environment, and even on a secondary environment. So that's really the key benefit there. So from a backup configuration standpoint, it's pretty straightforward. And for anyone who's ever set up a job, you're not doing anything different. You're choosing your VMs or data stores, which in this particular case we've chosen a whole data store, which works quite well with volumes on the NetApp. And we're then choosing which repository we want to back up this data to. So this would typically be your E-series target, where you're defining a short to mid-term retention that you want to keep on an E-series target. And you don't need to do anything else here in order to get that storage integration, because by default, the primary storage integration option is always enabled. So as long as you've connected to your NetApp and you create these jobs, this all works under the hood. And Chris, when you probably set it up, you would agree that there wasn't much more you had to do. Yeah,
exactly. And then I think one of the key options on that screen there is the option in the middle is that if for whatever reason we can't get that on-tap snapshot, we're still going to back up directly through vCenter over the network and get a copy of that VM. So you've still got that failback safety net for you.
So you always have your backup regardless?
Yes.
But ideally it's going to do the storage efficient way. Network efficient way,
Yeah, very good point. And that's pretty much it from a basic backup standpoint. I mean, one of the other jobs that I wanted to show was, how we actually back up from a NetApp SnapMirror. And this really starts to show some of the integration points that we've got where the job is exactly the same. We set it up the same. What we do that's different is we now can configure what we call a secondary destination, and this allows us to then choose one of the different options, and this might just take a little while to load. You notice when you choose add, we're now able to leverage where we're actually doing a backup from. So is it from the SnapMirror, which we've got selected here and why it's grayed out? And if I go to that particular SnapMirror, I'm able to choose it as the data source for actually doing the backup. And this is something that we showed in the slide, where you're now not actually backing up from the primary array, you're actually backing up from the secondary array. So where you're wanting to reduce the amount of impact potentially on the production array or production data center, this is really that use case here, and this is how you configure it. The other options in there, we're really just being able to retain a next number of snapshots on a primary array or a secondary array. So you'll notice that you can choose, snap vaults as well. And I'll show you that on the other job. So this one here was really just to showcase that, we can back up from the secondary array. But this particular job here does exactly, what I was mentioning before, where I can go through as normal. I go to my secondary target, and I've now got a snap vault selected, and I've chosen the number of, copies I want to keep that are being sent straight to snap vaults. And that's really it. And I mean, Chris, you can probably elaborate more.
Yeah, I think the important thing, if you can just go back one screen.
Yep.
If anyone's set up a Veeam backup job before, if you go into advanced settings, you've had to configure things like, do I want to do a forward incremental, reverse incremental, incrementals forever? If you notice this advanced screen now, because on the job we selected.
I'll go to it.
On the prime,
I'll go to this one.
Yep. There's a lot more settings when you're doing a standard Veeam backup job. How often do you want to do active full backups? Do you want to do checks and rebuilds of your backup files? There's a lot more tabs and settings there. Is that when you integrate with the NetApp snapshots and you're using the NetApp Snap as the primary source, all those decisions are taken away from you. You don't have to worry, is it a full, is it a reverse, is it an active full, is it an incremental? Because of the way NetApp snapshots work, is you're essentially getting a full copy of your data or your VM every time we take a snapshot. So you don't have to worry about those decisions anymore. Everything is a full. There's no restore change. You don't have to have fulls and a chain of incrementals to be able to recover. You can just always recover from any of those snapshots, and it's always the entire system.
And so from a consistency perspective, I guess that would impact the way, how long it takes to restore.
Yeah, particularly because we're using flex clones to recover that volume. So flex clone, you're getting the speed of NetApp because our flex clones are instantaneously created. They're read-write. They get mounted off to the ESX host, and you're getting the same performance from your storage as your production VMs can be getting. And then you can just storage remotion it straight back. It's the same performance. It's easy. It's good.
Cool. Excellent. Very good points. And I think the only other thing that I was going to mention there was that, obviously once you've created your SnapMirror and your SnapVault relationships, Veeam is really just, picking up on those and using those relationships to do, either sending, using SnapMirror or sending those snapshots to SnapVault. The hard work is really taken out of it, and setting up the jobs is actually very straightforward. So that last job with SnapVault, basically will show you, which snapshots have fallen out of retention. So if you've defined to keep, 72, which was in this case, any snapshot that has, fallen out of that retention, you'll notice here Veeam is going through and transferring the snapshots, it's doing the SnapVault update, and then it's applying the retention to remove any old snapshots out of there. So pretty straightforward. Now, from a recovery standpoint, and Chris really touched upon this, is that all recoveries with Veeam will be done, underneath the backup option here. So you're going to see all your different volumes underneath the storage snapshots. So I'll be able to open up, my NetApp one and see my virtual machines and my restore points. And of course, if you've been backing up to your E-series target, you're going to be able to do the same. So I can see my NetApp snap mirrors. I can see my snapshots. And I'm able to go through and choose a particular one that I want to restore from. So I thought it'd be useful to do a quick recovery just to show, I guess, some of the different options. And I'll just pick one of our Exchange servers as an example. Let me just go down to...
Everybody knows how fun Exchange restores are, right?
Yeah, so they can always be a little bit tricky. But, obviously... Veeam covers all the different Microsoft applications. So I mentioned before that you've got, AD, you've got Exchange, you've got SQL, and once you've created a job with Veeam, whether it's a NetApp Snap, and the three options that came up for the NetApp Snap was Instant VM, was doing files, was doing application items. If you've got any other kind of recovery that you need to do, from the E-series where Veeam has created a backup file, you get a couple more options where you may need to restore a Veeam decay, or if you're trying to restore, for example, a VMX, you can do that from there. So it means that you can now cover a whole bunch more different recovery scenarios, depending on what the problem is that's happened. And
we don't actually need those options. Like, it's not like it's a limitation that we don't get those from the storage snapshots. The reason they're not there is simply don't need it.
Exactly.
Because we can create the flex clone and mount it, your entire VM is back within a matter of seconds, is that we don't need to grab out an individual VM DK and push that back to a data store for you, because you've got the entire VM. If you want, you can then manage it within vCenter, copy the files, mount it as a different name, connect it to different networks, do whatever you want.
Exactly, yeah. So it just covers all the different scenarios. But if you are wanting to do, for example, an Exchange recovery, in this particular case, I get the option for Exchange, and because there is probably SQL on there, that option's coming up. But if I run the Exchange option, what Veeam is going to ask me here is for a particular restore point. And I'm choosing a point in time. I run through the wizard, and what I'm going to be able to do here is have what we call a Veeam Explorer for Exchange open up this particular restore point. And like Chris said, if this is a storage snapshot, it's going to leverage FlexClone to bring up that virtual machine. We're then able to drill in and see what's in there. So, if I open up a particular mailbox database, I will then be able to see the user mailboxes. So if I pick, just a random mailbox, I can then open that up and see what's inside of it. If I'm searching for anything in particular, I've got the advanced find option here. So I can search for There might be emails that I know the subject, I remember the attachment name. But once you've found what you need, the different recovery options are pretty straightforward. So I can restore directly back to Exchange, and that can go straight back into the user's inbox. I can export it out as a PST, or get those items as dot messages, or I can even email a recipient if I've set up SMTP, which I believe is not set up here, but once you set up the SMTP settings, I can actually send Chris, for example, these particular items, and he can then grab those items and put them, where he likes. So it just gives a little bit of flexibility around, the different Exchange recovery options. I won't go through all the other applications, but a lot of them will recover their respective application items. So SQL will be databases and tables, SharePoint will be documents and sites. And Chris, you might have used some of these in your previous role, or even now.
Yeah. I used to use these all the time. Our Exchange guys particularly loved the Exchange integration.
Do you need to install a separate agent in order to get those snapshots? Being able to get to that level of granularity?
No, you don't. So Veeam injects its own VSS driver into the Windows OS at the time of the backup. So it leverages vCenter to inject those in, gets that catalog of what's on the VM. There's Active Directory, Exchange, SQL, and then talks to the Microsoft VSS writers and says, hey, can you put these in a consistent state so we can back you up? Then it takes the VM snapshot and then releases them back to the guest OS, and that's how Veeam's able to be aware of what's inside those VMs and can then leverage these explorers. So the only limitation on using all of this is you do need Veeam Enterprise Plus licensing, and you do need to license SnapMirror and SnapVault on tap to be able to do this. So they're the only limitations. If you've got those, you can use all of this out of the box.
Yep, excellent. Thank you for that, Chris. And I think the last thing I really wanted to demonstrate is really just to go through some of that on-demand sandbox stuff. So I mentioned how the virtual lab can be leveraged for a way of doing, troubleshooting, potentially being able to do recoverability verification. And on the Veeam backup infrastructure section, we've got a technology or a job called Sure Backup. And what Sure Backup really comprises of is pretty much the virtual lab environment. But before you create the virtual lab environment, you've got to create essentially an application group. So the best way to describe an application group is that it's going to be the server that you want to bring up in this particular environment in the virtual lab. So it may be that you want to bring up a domain controller because you need to do some troubleshooting on a DC. And one of the challenges of doing that in production is that you may not want the changes to be replicated to another DC. So Veeam isolates that DC so that it won't replicate to its partners. It allows you to drill into it, do your troubleshooting. And in this particular application group, you're able to choose what the roles are of that domain controller. So is it just the DC? Is it also your DNS survey? Is it global catalog? And what that then opens up is that when we do testing, for example, of the domain controller, we're able to not just make sure that it can power on and that the virtual machine hardware is okay, we can make sure that it can boot into the guest OS and there's no issues with the registry, but then also listen on certain ports. So once I've ticked those boxes, you'll actually notice that some of the test scripts that come up is as basic as listening, Veeam listening on port 53 and ensuring that that the DNS service is active. And these scripts are something that is predefined within Veeam. You can add your own scripts, and we've had some customers where there might be some, deeper integration or deeper testing that you want to do, and this is where you can plug in your own scripts that will then run as part of this application group. So that's just to give you a little glimpse of what the application group is really for. You can add multiple virtual machines, and the idea is that you would group VMs that are dependent on one another. So of course, most application servers will authenticate to DC, so you would probably include a domain controller in there. But once you've created your application group, what creates all the magic is really our virtual lab. And the virtual lab, I guess without spending too much time on all of it, is the virtual lab is a virtual router. And Veeam basically creates a proxy appliance. It's a Linux proxy appliance that we turn on to an E6i environment, and it basically allows us to ring fence the virtual machines that get powered into that environment. So I won't go through all the options for the virtual lab, but this is where you'll specify, what E6i host you're gonna choose. I can quickly go through it just here. You're going to choose what data store is going to store any changes that you make, and then you're going to configure the actual network settings for the virtual lab. So the virtual lab is going to have two interfaces. It's going to have an internal interface, and it's going to have an external interface. And of course, the internal interface is what's going to talk into that isolated environment. So once you go through this process, and we've got configuration guides for this, you'll be able to create the virtual lab, and that will create that little VM, that Linux VM on the VMware environment, that then always comes up first to then power on the virtual machines into it. So the very last part of it is actually creating the short backup job, which then basically just combines the two. So it'll ask you what virtual lab you're using, what application group you're using, and this is where you can schedule the virtual lab to run. So you'll pick the virtual lab, you'll pick the application group, and when you schedule this job to run, it's going to run it at the time that you want. And of course, if you're doing troubleshooting, you can keep the lab running for an extended period of time so that you can log into it, do what you need to, and then manually shut it down.
So just quickly, you mentioned troubleshooting as a use case. What are the other kind of quick use cases for having something like a virtual lab?
Well, one of the use cases is you can schedule this or basically link it to your backup jobs. So it will run following your NetApp snapshot, snapfold update. It'll then can mount the primary or the secondary snapshot. It can mount it, fire up those VMs, and actually test and validate that your backup does work, and so your applications are actually recoverable, because backups are only as good as the data you can recover, right? So this will actually recover it and it will send a PDF report to the administrators every day when that short backup job is run to say, these are all the tests I ran against your VMs, and yes, they did pass, you can recover this VM.
That's a very good use case.
Yes.
And that's pretty much it for the short backup job. I think what we're going to do now is go over to some questions, and we'll answer those live on the webinar. So I'm just going to switch back to my slides and pass over to you, Phoebe.
Yeah, sure. So I guess the questions that we have here, we mentioned, snapshots as being and this is NetApp snapshots as being a backup. Is there anything else that Veeam can offer in regards to, using those backups for ransomware protection or anything around, security, especially security being such a big thing at the moment? Yeah,
that's a good point. And look, I mean, I can probably talk briefly about what's coming in Update 4 and how the virtual lab is actually going to be used in those cases. And, I'm not sure if Chris, if you've gone across these, but, GDPR compliance, for example. So one of the things that we're introducing in Update 4 is what we're calling a staged restore. And the classic example there is that there's going to be cases where data needs to be restored into a production environment, but without particular bits of information. So it could be credit card information, could be user information. And what the Veeam Stage Restore will do is leverage the virtual lab to first turn on that virtual machine. We'll provide a wizard that allows users to run a script and extract that data outside of the backup that's been powered into the virtual lab, and then actually restore that server into production without that data. So the stage restore is something that is coming as part of Update 4. And then there's also a secure restore, which is actually tying into a lot of AV vendors out there. So the likes of McAfee and Trend Micro and the built-in Microsoft ones to then leverage that.
Cool. Yeah, if that's interesting to anybody, definitely security is a topic that's hot with all of my customers at the moment. So let us know. So we have to wrap up. We are almost out of time. So I've got a couple extra slides here. There are the Veeam documentation guides and that Veeam and NetApp configuration guide that Nelson mentioned, as well as the email addresses of our amazing guest geeks today. These slides will be available for you, so you can go to those links. And finally, we just have a couple of extra reminders that we will be at AWS reInvent next week in Las Vegas. If anybody is there, do pop by. I will be around, so reach out to me and say hello. And NetApp Insight Barcelona is the following week on the 3rd to the 5th of December. There are 5 Veeam and NetApp sessions. Some are being run by NetApp team members from Veeam, so there's a lot of really good information in those sessions. If you will be at Insight, I will be there as well, so do come say hello. The next Geek Out is not Veeam and NetApp, but the next Geek Out will be next year in 2019, so I look forward to seeing you all there. And thank you again for joining us on Geek Out this year. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.